finally get back to you guys after the holidays, and I was thinking I wanted to do a fantasy analyzed video. It's been about 5 months since I've made a video where I take a weapon from a fantasy setting and overanalyze it for realism. So I'm doing one of those, but I've decided to take a step back from fantasy and step into another genre I like quite a bit, sci-fi. So naturally I went towards Star Wars. So today we will be analyzing the DC-15LE from Star Wars Battlefront II. The second Battlefront II. Who keeps naming these? Guys, I think you need to get a new whoever names these. I mean, you've got Battlefront 2, but there was already been a Battlefront 2, so it's just like, what, Battlefront 4? Do you multiply? Do you add? I suppose it wouldn't make a difference here. And then you've got your Battlefield 1, which is actually the 15th installment in the series, but it's Battlefield 1. Anyway, back to the gun. I don't really want to analyze the weapon for what it shoots, whether it be plasma or lasers. There's people out there who are much smarter than I am who have come up with their own theories. The game actually does state it's plasma, and I think that's a general agreement amongst the sci-fi and Star Wars community, is that they do shoot plasma. So I'm going to assume they do shoot plasma here. But that's not really what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about more the overall shape, ergonomics, and just how well you can handle them and use them. So to start off with, this weapon is a heavy weapon, according to the game, and it looks to be made entirely of metal. Now, this could be a problem or it could not be. It depends. An all-metal weapon could be quite heavy. However, it could use the Star Wars fantasy metal, which is Durasteel, and I'm not sure how heavy that is. But that could be what it is. But I'm going to assume the weight is appropriate. So not really an issue. Lengthwise, it seems fine. It doesn't seem any longer than weapons we use in a modern setting in actual warfare, so it doesn't seem like it's going to be an issue. What I'm concerned about is its shape, though. There really seems to be nowhere to put your hand, or your offhand rather, your supporting hand. When you're using a weapon, you have your firing hand, whether you're left or right-handed, your dominant hand, your firing hand, goes on the grip of the rifle. Now, depending on your rifle, it may not have a pistol grip like this, but it goes on the grip, and your supporting hand goes forward and supports it in some way. In this case, I've got just a vertical grip that I like quite a bit, so I like to hold it here. However, some people may like to hold it like this, back here on the magazine while in the magazine. Lots of people like to hold it different ways, but there are many options. However, with the DC-15LE, there's really not much of an option. Right where you'd want to put your hand is this giant cylinder, and I'm not sure how supporting that would be. It looks to be held on by a relatively thin piece of metal. I'm not sure what the cylinder does, I'm not sure its importance, so I don't know if it could be moved around. I would personally, if I designed the weapon, shift it back if I could to open up that location for the handhold, because the only spot open is right in front of the trigger guard, which would be the equivalent of holding my rifle right here, assuming it didn't have a magazine, which is quite weird. That leaves a lot of weight up front for me to have to support. It's easier if I can move my hand out. So this isn't bad. However, you can't do that in the DC-15LE because there's that cylinder there. And I suppose you could put your hand on it. I'm not sure how comfortable it would be, but even then, it sits considerably lower than the barrel. So it'd be kind of like holding it like this. And so it could be done, but I think it'd take training. It might be kind of awkward, but I suppose it could be done. The other place is out there beyond that cylinder that's hanging out the bottom, but I think it's really far out. That'd be kind of like holding, let's see if I can move my hand around here. It'd be kind of like holding a rifle like this, which isn't particularly comfortable because that means my hand is really far away from my body. Somewhere right in here is just about perfect. The other problem I have with this weapon is its sights, or rather the lack of sights. Now this is a problem I find to be pretty consistent amongst Star Wars weapons. They don't have much of sights, if any. They might just have like just front sights or back sights. This gun doesn't seem to have any. And worse yet, it's got this little triangle thing on the top that will block any chance of, just looking down the top of the rifle to get some sort of sight, because it sticks up so far. In fact, when you put the scope attachment on it in Battlefront 2, it blocks the scope. There's no way you could see through it. So, bit of a design flaw, I would think, but hey, if it works, I guess. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the attachments. Now, in Battlefront II, the second one, you can put an attachment on it called Reduced Recoil, and the description is digital rangefinder that calculates distance during sustained fire to compensate weapon recoil. Now, this actually doesn't make any sense, because that's not how recoil works. Now I can understand if you used recoil data and distance information and compiled it together and was able to adjust its fire, whether it be its fire rate or simply maybe its pattern of fire, to compensate and so it'd be more accurate at those ranges, that would make sense. However, range has nothing to do with recoil, so you can have all of the information on this range, windage, everything. It doesn't matter. That doesn't affect your recoil at all. Your recoil is simply a reaction of a projectile being thrown out the front. Now we could argue that it's plasma, so it's probably not going to have any recoil, but I'm going to assume it does, simply because it does in-game, and we're analyzing this on an in-game function. Now I'm aware that the game put it there for the purpose of a mechanic and balance within the game, but let's assume for some reason within the universe of Star Wars it has recoil. It still doesn't work. Range has nothing to do with your weapon recoil. So having a digital rangefinder that calculates distance during sustained fire to compensate weapon recoil doesn't help you. What else I find to be a little weird about it is it's got an eyepiece on the back of this rangefinder. Fine, okay, that makes sense. I mean, you want to be able to look for it. However, the idea isn't that you're aiming down this while shooting, it's doing it automatically. So I don't know that you really need to do it, but okay. Secondly, there's no opening on the front of this rangefinder. So I'm willing to believe that it's just some sort of sensor, or maybe even a camera, so I guess it's not a huge deal, but I don't think there's any reason to particularly use it, especially if you have the scope attachment on too, which you'd be looking down that. So, and it's quite large. We have modern rangefinders which are much smaller, but since this one is somehow magically reducing the recoil simply because it knows the range, I'm gonna let it pass for being so big. I mean, if you can use basic magic like that, make it as big as you want. Final thing I want to note about it is that it sits, because it's so large and it sits off to the side, it could potentially affect the balance and handling of the weapon. Generally, when you have something that big, you kind of want to put it centered. This applies to really anything, but particularly the weapon. If you have a heavy attachment and it's set off to the side, and not to say there's problems sticking out the side, we do that all the time. However, it's flashlights, maybe a laser sight, maybe even a rangefinder, or an IR strobe or something. But it's not sticking off 3-4 inches, it's right here. You start sticking it off that far and it can affect the balance of the weapon. Now that's not to say it's really going to make it much harder to hold and aim, probably not, for no bigger it is and no farther it is sticking off. However, where it might affect is when you're shooting, particularly with recoil. So if you have a little bit extra weight on the side, it might affect your recoil. Whereas before it would fire back and maybe up a little bit, instead now it's kind of firing back and to the right, and it affects your recoil, which makes your follow-up shots more difficult. Again, plasma probably wouldn't have recoil, but it does within the game, so I'm going to assume that's a factor to take into account here. The next attachment I want to talk about is the scope. And as I mentioned before, the biggest problem here is that it's blocked. The little triangle pyramid thing in the middle of the rifle actually sticks up farther than the viewpoint of the scope, so you couldn't use it. But assuming that doesn't exist or has some way around that, I don't know. Let's assume it works. So let's take a look into it. The exact definition of it in-game is weapon scope with mid-range magnification for greater zoom distances. Kind of an odd wording, but I know what they mean. So it's makes sense, unlike the last one. It actually is very possible. Pretty basic here. No real complaints. The only thing I mentioned is simply that it is blocked by part of the rifle. But that's really about it. The next attachment is the exploding shot, and the game defines it as unstable plasma that explodes on impact, dispersing the bolt damage across a small area. Due to its volatile nature, the blaster builds heat significantly faster. Now, this kind of confuses me. So it says that when it strikes, it explodes, and so instead of just delivering all of the bolt's damage into its single surface area, it's now spread over a slightly larger area. So by saying that, it means that there's no more or less plasma in it. It's just simply reacts different. Instead of just hitting, it now hits and explodes. So why does it build heat faster? I don't think that it would. Again, I'm not an expert on plasma by any means, but if it's doing the same amount of damage, it's just dispersing over a different area, I would think that it's the same amount of plasma, so it wouldn't really build heat any faster. Now, depending on how it works. Now, from my basic understanding of plasma, how you'd probably want to hold it together while you're shooting it so it's not just kind of going like a deadly fart. And so to actually go somewhere is you need to contain it in a magnetic field. So the only thing I can think is that this magnetic field is significantly weaker, so as it impacts something, maybe that magnetic field breaks apart, allowing the plasma to disperse. And so then potentially, maybe the magnetic field being weaker means it doesn't hold in as much of the heat, but then again, I don't know that the magnetic field actually holds in any heat to begin with. So maybe that's something to do with it. But the attachment that it gives a little bit of a funnel at the tip of the barrel, which I'm just going to assume is just so that the game gives some sort of aesthetic for it being an exploding shot, simply because the mechanical functions of making the plasma bolt more volatile is going to be internal, something you can't see. So I'm going to assume that the funnel muzzle brake is simply for aesthetics. However, if you are heating up much faster, wouldn't you want to make the modification to your weapon to be maybe an actual muzzle brake that's vented? Maybe have a vented barrel, maybe make that aesthetic change as actual function. Now, since you're overheating, now it's going to keep cooling faster, or something like that. I think that'd be the better option there. But other than that, I don't really see any major problems with it. So a couple of things I wanted to point out, maybe I'm being a bit nitpicky, maybe I'm not, is I feel like the handle's really thin, the grip on the back, the pistol grip. When you have a grip, you want it to be able to fit comfortably in your hand. So this is designed to be used either barehanded or with relatively thin gloves, and it works just fine. It fits my hand nicely, it's comfortable. That grip is so thin on this rifle, and if you rotate it, and as you rotate the weapon in game, you can see that the handle seems quite thin. Maybe not too much thinner than this, however, they're using plastic gloves, the majority of them, and I think that'd be really hard to hold on to with a big, bulky plastic glove. Furthermore, it's square, which would make it even harder to hold on to, and if you are barehanded or wearing relatively thin gloves, it'd be uncomfortable to wear. So generally you want to stay away from square grips, simply because the hand's natural shape to form to isn't a square. Maybe a rounded square or rounded rectangular is a much better choice, but that's just being kind of nitpicky. Something I found to be neat, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is the trigger looks to be a double trigger. It's got two finger twirls cut out of it, so instead of it just being a single finger, it looks like you hold it 2 fingers and shoot, which is just something interesting. Kind of makes me wonder about the trigger pull on it. Maybe it's got a really heavy trigger pull, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's just to allow for a shorter grip, so that you only have to fit 2 fingers on your grip instead of 3, so that 2 fingers can get in the trigger and you can have an overall shorter grip, which is something interesting if that's the case. It's interesting that they would have thought about that, because in a bulkier glove like stormtroopers or clone troopers might have, that'd be an issue, because I mean, to be able to fit 3 fingers, since your fingers are bigger, you would definitely need to have a longer grip to accommodate that. So if you want to have still a shorter or rather normal grip while having your bigger gloves, you can put a trigger that requires 2 fingers to bolt, or fits 2 fingers rather. But it's weird that they would have thought about that, but not thought about the relative thinness of the grip itself being an issue. The other thing is there's a bolt on the back of the rifle right about here in this area, and it looks like it holds the whole grip assembly on. Yeah, it'd be uncomfortable barehanded and impossible with a glove, because as you're holding it, your hand you don't hold a rifle like this, you hold it up here. So as you're doing that, having a bolt right in here is just going to dig into the hand. In fact, there are several rifles I've seen that have a sling mount here, and I can't stand them because they dig into my hand, and I've got small hands. Throw on a glove, like a plastic glove or something, like a clone trooper or stormtrooper might wear, you're probably not going to feel it too much, but your hand's not going to fit. Your hand's not going to ride up all the way in there. Instead, it's probably going to have to sit much farther down here, which is going to give you less control of the weapon. So maybe that's why they're always missing. Between having no real good handholds, no sights or sights that are completely blocked by a piece of the weapon, and grips that are difficult to hold on to, I'd probably have trouble firing my weapon too. Particularly if you start throwing on attachments that throw off the balance of my rifle, so every time I shoot it, it pulls a weird way. But anyway, it's just my over-analysis of the DC-15LE, just for a bit of fun, entertainment. You know, I still enjoy the game, still enjoy the gun in-game. I just wish they'd fix that annoying glitch where sometimes you aim down a scope and you just get a blank screen. But anyway, hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.